Welcome back to the afternoon's part of the proceedings, and to what I think is your first, not that what happened earlier wasn't a taster lecture, but this is less about studying and more an example of how the studying would work. Andrew and David talked about the various forms of teaching available, and this, what I'm about to do, is a small taster, or probably really like a segment, a small bit of a lecture. So one of the, I think Andrew described it as an hour of an academic talking to you. That's one way of describing it, but you might have your own by the end of this. So I'm Emma Greensmith. I'm a fellow and tutor of classical languages and literature at St John's College in Oxford. There are both Oxford and Cambridge have a St John's, and I'm a fellow of the Oxford version. What that really means is that I teach Greek and Latin language and literature to students at St John's, and often other students too, across their whole classics degree. So from their first all the way up to their final years, in an array of different papers. In my own research, when I'm not teaching, my main area is Greek epic, and I look at Greek epic from Homer all the way up to how it was received in late antiquity and beyond. So I also do the reception of epic. And at the moment, for those who are interested, I'm writing a book on Homer and the Bible. So that's one of my areas. Not that I'm going to be talking about the Bible part of it today, or not explicitly, but if you're interested, feel free to ask me and I'll tell you how that's going. Final thing there is to say about me is that before I took up this position in Oxford, I spent many, many years in Cambridge as a classicist. I did my undergraduate degree here, where I learnt Greek myself as a total beginner, then my master's and my PhD, and also a research fellowship. So although people talk jokingly and otherwise about Oxford and Cambridge being the great rivals, the fact that I'm here today, I'm kind of living proof that they are, how they both are genuinely brilliant places to study classics and to live and work. So if you want to know anything about either place, then do ask me. That's enough about me, and now more about Greek literature. This lecture today, as you might see from the title, is about the Odyssey, but it also is about classics. It's about how I think one of the ways that we can use the Odyssey specifically as a piece of Greek literature to think about why the ancient world and its literature genuinely and specifically still matters to a 21st century readership. Now, that's something we are often asked as classical academics. You may well often be asked as people thinking about studying classics, not just what do you want to do with that? Do you want to become a big shot lawyer? But also, well, why? Why does it matter? It's a question that is worth having an answer to, but we should never start on the defence. And as a scholar, I'm really not into making quick or, as it were, lazy analogies between the ancient and modern world. I think that's patronising to both worlds, as it were. And respecting differences and thinking about what's not similar is as important and interesting as drawing the dots. But at the same time, I think if we're willing to think deeply and critically and above all sensitively about ancient literature in its own right, whatever we think that will mean, the connections might come to us, and they'll be all the more meaningful if we don't force them. So I'm going to talk for about 20-25 minutes, and then I'm going to have hopefully 5 or so minutes for discussion. It can be about anything. I'm going to be here afterwards on a stool, so feel free to ask about the content. I'm not expecting any expertise. I'm emphatically, deliberately not asking who's read the Odyssey. If you have, great. If you haven't, do. Not because you have to, just because it's great. And hopefully this will be an indication of why. But expertise or none, please do ask questions. The more instinctive questions are often the best ones. And it goes without saying, you won't be judged for them one way or another. I will genuinely just want you to ask. So let's start. In 1994, Jonathan Shea, who is and was a clinical psychiatrist at Tufts Medical School in Boston, wrote a book about Homer's Iliad. And Shea starts the book with the line, "The Iliad is a poem about soldiers in war." Now, from a classicist perspective, that's hardly a tremendous insight. It's not a line that I would particularly praise if I saw it in an essay. But coming from Jonathan Shea, who is not a classicist using psychology, and there are many, many different critical theories that we as classical researchers like to apply to classical texts, But Shea is literally not that kind of doctor. He's a clinical psychologist turned psychiatrist using classics. And what his book is entitled is Achilles at Vietnam. So the fact that for Shea, the Iliad is a poem about soldiers in war means something quite specific. It means something quite different. And Shea's central argument in Achilles at Vietnam is that the wrath of Achilles, the first words of the Iliad, as you might know or will soon know, the first word is menis, which means, actually very hard to translate, anger, wrath, destructive grief of some sort. It doesn't have quite an English equivalent. But that Achilles is, let's say, anger, offers an accurate picture of the experience, the emotional experience of combat trauma. As Shea, as a psychologist, working with veterans of the Vietnam War, had seen, experienced by some of the soldiers in Vietnam, and indeed, Shea argues, probably in every war. Now, this in some ways offers a way of thinking about the Iliad, of thinking about Achilles. Some of Achilles' most deplorable actions, and there are many deplorable actions in the Iliad, deplorable from Homer's perspective too. He never praises them in the way that he might praise other heroic attributes, can be understood through a psychological lens. The things like the excess of Achilles' rage and despair at the loss of Patroclus, which leads him to do things like commit human sacrifice, which even in the ancient world, especially in the ancient world, always was never acceptable at all. His refusal of mercy to people who supplicate him, young people, his abuse of Hector's body and brutalization of his corpse. These actions are brutal. And it's not that they show that Achilles is human in any kind of happy-clappy, we are humans because of our flaws, but he's a human who has experienced the very specific, life-changing experience of war. So it might help us read Achilles, but it also helps us use Achilles to read, from Shea's perspective, people that he was actively treating. As I say, he was an active clinical psychiatrist. And he was using the Iliad in translation with people he was working with in his clinic. They would read passages, they would act out scenes. And according to Shea in this book, he did so for precisely these reasons. Trauma, savagery, violence, and rage. The Iliad does. It doesn't beautify these actions. It might put them into poetry, but it doesn't poeticize them. It puts them into song as a lived experience by a hero who is never straightforwardly heroic or evil. Evil is not an Iliadic word. And so what Shea says is that it's a way of not universalizing what these soldiers that he was working with has been through, but getting them to read something specific and something that was so sort of understandable and uncannily similar that arguably it could make them feel less alone. Now that's great, but that doesn't really tell us anything about Odysseus. But I actually think that what Shea's done here with Achilles in Vietnam does, of course, tell us a lot about Achilles, but it also tells us quite a lot about Odysseus. Because the Odyssey, Odysseus' heroic poem, unlike the Iliad, could not be described as a poem about soldiers in war. In fact, its plot is a lot harder to summarize. Aristotle, some of you may have heard of him, ancient literary critic, among other things. I think one of the papers that you were shown earlier was Aristotle's From Turtles to something or other. So Aristotle wrote about many things. He also wrote about Homer and about tragedy. He had a go at summarizing the plot of the Odyssey. And he went for, a man is away from his home for many years, under the hostile eye of Poseidon, and alone. The situation at home is such that his property is being wasted by the suitors. They're plotting against his son. And then the hero returns after great hardship, and after revealing his identity to certain persons, makes his attack, saving himself while destroying his enemies. Now, the more you go on to read and study the Odyssey, that is a summary, but it's quite revealing for what it leaves out as well as for what it puts in. Why, for instance, does Aristotle feel that Poseidon's anger is part of the Odyssey's plot, but Athena's friendship with Odysseus is not? And the extent to which Odysseus is always under the hostile eye of Poseidon is debatable. Why do the suitors of Odysseus' property get a mention, but not their obsessive attempts to wed and sleep with Odysseus' wife? The suitors are the suitors of Penelope, and she's not mentioned here. It's a very male-dominated summary. And why does Aristotle feel that the essence of the poem is concentrated in the second half, whereas some of the most famous books, the books that a lot of people have heard of, the Cyclops, for example, the blinding of the Cyclops, isn't here. So it's a powerfully partial summary. But I think what Aristotle is no idiot. So the fact that Aristotle finds it so hard to summarize such a kaleidoscopic poem proves that it's a poem that resists summarizing pretty much at all. And modern critics have fared equally badly. There are certain sort of anthologies that say sort of the best books of the Odyssey. That you just can't pick the best books of the Odyssey. It doesn't divide like that. So if the Odyssey is profoundly hard to get to grips with, the reason for that surely is because of its hero. The Iliad centres around war, about soldiers and war, about Achilles' rage. But what the Odyssey centres around is its man, is its hero, is Odysseus. Its opening lines, I said the Iliad starts with the wrath, the anger, the menace of Achilles. Well, the Odyssey starts like this. Tell me, muse, of the man of many turns, driven far astray, after he had sacked the sacred citadel of Troy. So it's a poem in the aftermath of a war, to hold that straight away, after the climax, as it were, of Troy in flames. And it's about a man who's unnamed, of the man, and then this very strange phrase, of many turns, and about the fact that he has been displaced. The Greek is even more provocative here. Now, not expecting, again, I'm not doing a show of hands, I would imagine some people already know Greek, some don't. If and when you do, one thing you might know about Greek is that it's much more flexible in its word order. So you can really throw quite profound emphasis by the order in which you place words, in prose as well as poetry, but particularly in poetry. Now, the Greek, as you may be able to recognise, starts, andra, from which we get many English words, with the word for man. So it literally starts with man. Not even the man, just man. So we know that there's going to be something really anthropocentric, really human-centred in this poem, and very singular. But we don't know who. And Odysseus isn't named for such a long time. We also get Odysseus' first adjective. Adjectives in poetry, in Greek, as they are in English, but particularly in Greek, carry so much interpretative meaning. We can learn so much about someone's identity. They're like micro-identity markers and adjective. They weigh such a punch. This adjective is quite amazing. It's the first time we see this adjective in Greek literature. It's not in the Iliad at all. And it's in the first line of the Odyssey to describe this central hero. It is, and incidentally, it's only actually in one other piece of archaic poetry, which is almost certainly riffing off the Odyssey. So Homer's language is very formulaic. He uses words repetitively on purpose for emphasis. This word is weird and it knows it. It's a compound. The polou means many or much, and then the tropon bit means something like way. But even in English, way is weird. It could be an actual way, like a road, so that would kind of make sense. The man who has travelled many roads, referring to his journeys. But it can also be a more metaphorical type, so the man who's like gone round many turns in his mind. So it can refer to mental versatility, characteristics, or going with a mind that goes round many turns, slippery, deceptive, trickery. So the same word that's supposed to give us the opening identity markers to this incredible man, this incredible hero, can push in so many different directions. The man who's gone many ways is descriptive. It's descriptive of his journey. The man of many mental turns could make him sound a bit slippery. It could be a negative trait. So he kind of is defined by being extremely hard to define. And incidentally, Emily Wilson, whose translation many of you may have come across, she translates it as "tell me, muses, of the complicated man," which I think is quite an interesting way of doing it. She admits that the word is complicated like the man. And I think in some ways that the fact that Odysseus, his first appearance, as it were, in Homeric poetry is so hard to pin down, has meant that he has fared very, very differently to Achilles, who is straightforwardly driven by complicated emotions, yes, but anger, rage, brutality, violence. If Odysseus' characteristics are more connected to either where he's been, what he knows, or what he thinks, that is in a sense much harder just to narrate in poetry. he always requires interpretation to get to grips with. And perhaps as a result of that, Achilles and Odysseus have from the very beginning been contraposed, been placed against one another. It's a weird fact that Achilles and Odysseus are two of the most major heroes in Homeric epic. They appear in so few scenes together. They fight the same war, they're on the same side, but in the whole of the Iliad, they barely interact. And this second passage here is one of the few moments where they do meet in the Iliad, and that's when Odysseus is part of an embassy who's trying to get Achilles to return to fight. And Odysseus does this really, really long, very clever speech. And Achilles, at the end, tells him basically to shut up. And he says, well, as hateful as Hades is the man who thinks one thing and says another. So for him, for Achilles, polytropos means lying, deceptive. And even in the Odyssey, we get this very oblique reference. This is in a song of Demodocus. It's not part of the main Odyssean plot, about how there was a quarrel between Achilles and Odysseus. We don't get that in Homeric epic. And scholars have been divided to what this might refer to. But they have history, clearly. And this history goes on. Plato, who was mentioned earlier as one of the key philosophers that you'll have the chance to study at both Oxford and Cambridge, in one of his dialogues, the Hippias Minor, Hippias and Socrates are having a debate about which hero is better, Achilles and Odysseus. And this matters to the pursuit of philosophical truth that's going on. And Hippias uses this same passage of the Odyssey to say, well, Achilles is true, alithes, and simple, haplus. Now, not two words that we necessarily always put together in modern identity politics. And Odysseus is polytropos, so using that word again, and pseudes, and lying. So for Plato's Hippias, polytropos is deceptive. It is about lying. And so this fact that they are put as two sides of the heroic coin so intensely, so dramatically, in a way that so infrequently happens in Homer, could well have something to do with the way that how Odysseus has been received in his kind of long reception history, has indeed been more, let's say, ambivalent, or perhaps more problematic. In Greek tragedy, for example, another genre which you'll have the opportunity to read and think about a lot, Odysseus is often not present, but even when he is, and especially when he's not, is often a real kind of architect of darkness. After the sack of Troy, for example, as many tragedies dramatise, he is the mastermind behind some of the most brutal acts, but a very different form of brutality, very measured, very controlled. For example, the killing of Hector's son Astyanax so that the Trojan line cannot continue. The very brutal division of the women of Troy and where they go. And this is just an example that I added in this morning because I was reading a piece, and I won't say where it was, a few weeks ago, and it was a thought piece about Bill Clinton. And it was all about his kind of slick self-presentation and his deceptiveness. And the journalist used the word Odyssean, just casually, almost, to describe Clinton. Now, that sparked me for many reasons, but I think it goes to show how there's a problem here. Odysseus is always already one of the most complicated heroes to get to grips with, as Emily's Wilson word complicated made clear. But it was his name that was used as this sort of casual, as though it's obvious that he's negative, as though it's obvious that what Odysseus represents is, that complicated means deceptive, that deceptive means slimy, that slimy means lying, and all of those things just follow on. And that is actually not very Odyssean at all. So with my last sort of couple of minutes, I just want to have a look at one of the many ways in which we could probably rethink the polytropic, the complicated nature of Odysseus, not to kind of make him into I'm not going to do a redemption narrative, because, as I said, evil is not a Homeric concept. Good and evil, hero and anti-hero, they're not the right words to think with when we get deep into these texts. And there are actually many ways in which Odysseus' complicatedness, as it is deep within Homer's poetry, if we don't just talk about these characters, if we actually read with them, read deeply into them, and we have these texts to do so, actually makes him even better to think with. for a huge number of different ways and relationships. And the full version of this lecture, there are lots of different ways that I kind of rethink Odysseus, looking at how he interacts with his enemies, looking at some of his patterns of speech. I'm just going to very quickly do one. So if you want the full lecture, well, you know where to find me. One of the ways that I find Odysseus very good to think with is in his relationship, his interactions with the female characters in Homer's world. Now, it is a complicated truth of epic, a genre that I work with on a daily basis, that it has an incredible amount of interesting, fully fleshed female characters. But it, and by epic I mean many different epics, resists promoting the feminine to a central part of its ideology. So ancient epic values like kleos, like time, honour, glory, material gains, martial gains, these all remain masculine. And when I use the word resist, I think that's quite important. It's not that there aren't females who matter, it's actually a clash, almost a clash that epic knows, between the female characters and the core values. And actually the female characters can help us think through those core values as always already knowing that they're not quite right. There's always a bit of a kind of resistance there between what epic is and what it actually does. So the feminine versus the female. And Odysseus, you know, that first word, andra, I mean, andra actually doesn't necessarily need to just mean the man, but it clearly later on does mean the man. Odysseus is a masculine hero. One of the most amazing and interesting things about Odysseus is some of his most fascinating moments where he becomes his most himself, as it were, are when he interacts with women. Particularly his wife, Penelope, it could be very much read as the kind of archetypal, subservient wife. She doesn't wander. She doesn't go many places. She stays at home. In this kaleidoscopic geography of the Odyssey, she doesn't leave. But when Odysseus gets back, she embodies as many of his potentially lying, potentially deceptive, or hyper-clever, hyper-engaged rhetorical traits as he does. And both of these passages, I'm not going to read them out in full, but these are sort of two passages worth looking at, one from book 19 and one from book 23. Odysseus is still disguised as a beggar at this point. And Penelope tricks Odysseus as much as he is used to tricking others. So I would say she kind of out Odysseus is Odysseus, and he responds in kind. Likewise, I mentioned in Aristotle's summary that he doesn't mention Penelope and he doesn't mention Athena. But another amazing part of the Odyssey's texture is this friendship between Odysseus and Athena. We don't get anything like this in the Iliad. The gods take sides in the Iliad, absolutely, but this very, very close, and I use friendship on purpose. And one of the key passages where we really see this is in book 13. Odysseus just got back to Ithaca, but is completely disoriented. This is an incredible passage where he wakes up and he doesn't know where he is, that feeling that you have immediately after a dream, where you don't quite know whether the nightmare's real or the good dream is real and what's reality. And just after this, Athena comes in disguise, and he's trying to work out if she's a god, if she's a goddess, who she is, and he's not revealing who he is either. So they're already playing each other, and there's so much uncertainty at stake. And she kind of loves this moment. And she's like, look, you're a bold man, you're crafty, you're insatiate in deceit. The Greek's a lot better than that. Even in your own land, you're not going to stop being trickery and deceitful, which you love from the bottom of your heart. But come, let's no longer sort of keep tricking one another, since we're both well-versed in craft. Since you are by far the best of all men in counsel and speech, and I among all the gods, and famed for wisdom and craft. This is a unique moment where a goddess says to a mortal, we are the same. I am the divine version of you, you are the mortal version of me. So this is, but one very quick version of how, if we actually look at Odysseus' interactions with, I say people, with women, and I also look at his enemies, with monsters, with men, with women, with gods. That's when, through speech, through being disoriented, through being isolated and suddenly having company again. Odysseus' heroics don't just come through who he fights, through who he kills, through who he doesn't kill, but actually who he speaks to. what he learns, what he doesn't learn, what he hides. And so there's a real kind of grittiness to that. You know, he's a hero formed of experiences. And interesting that some of his feminine moments, as it were, where the females become Odyssean and Odysseus becomes feminine, are at moments where Odysseus is at his most vulnerable. He's disguised as a beggar. He's washed up on the shore. And I said at the beginning that, well, at the beginning of this segment, that women are never promoted to kind of the core ancient epic values, like honour and glory. They're often seen themselves as marginal characters. But what the Odyssey gives us are these amazing moments of shared vulnerability. And in these moments, the divides of gender and of mortality, so two of the arguably greatest divides ever between gods and men and women, it's not that they don't matter anymore, but other things interact with them, like speech, like wisdom, like craft. And the Greek in itself pushes much harder at what's the difference between wisdom and craft. The English words there are useless in that way. And gender both doesn't matter across these divides. Now, as I say, there are lots of different aspects to this kind of rethinking Odysseus. I just want to finish, though, very, very briefly by going back to where I started, which is about kind of a modern heroics in this way. Now, in 2002, more than a decade after the end of Achilles, the publication of Achilles in Vietnam, Jonathan Shay wrote another Homeric book. This time, it was called Odysseus in America. Now, this deals with Vietnam's veterans' return home. And there's a key Odyssean word called nostos, from where we in English get nostalgia, but that's an incredibly complicated concept that I also lecture on, because homecoming and nostalgia, they do and don't mean the same thing, and the Odyssey is packed with ideas about both. But what Odysseus in America shines a light on is that homecoming is not war in an Achillean sense, but it has its own psychological experiences that need a different type of heroic language, different type of heroic models, different kind of epic. Now, I've been giving this lecture, versions of this lecture, for a while. As I was preparing to give it to you today, I thought long and hard about whether to say anything about the spotlight that has been shone recently on migration, on what happens when you have to leave your home through war, when you're driven away by war, when you don't know if and when you'll come home. And I really thought about what I said at the beginning, about that I really don't believe in being too quick or too strong with ancient and modern analogies. And because what people are going through now is real, and it is not the material for intellectual exercises. And so what I've kind of done is given you a version of my own thought process there. Part of me thought, having worked with the Odyssey for so long, that the Odyssey is, Odysseus is the ultimate wanderer. He does get home. He's changed by the experience, and we do get a deep type of psychological poetics through the language, through the poetry. I have not migrated. I do not know whether that poetic experience would or wouldn't help a lived experience. But what I can say, and you know, Shay's book gives a version of that, 2002 is also not now, is that I think it does show that Odysseus is an entirely different type of hero. He is defined by displacement and by the very difficult, brutalizing act of trying to return home to a society that will never be the same as when you left. You can't do the Odyssey without sensitive thinking. You can't do this kind of sensitive thinking without immersing yourself deeply in the text. So if this raises more questions than it answers, then I think that's a good thing. Because Odysseus, I don't want to end by saying, oh, he's the obvious hero for 21st century politics, but he's certainly a hero that I think is worth thinking with and thinking with again. Thank you. I don't know if I'm going to be chairing my own questions or if I can have a helpful person running around with the mic. Maybe like just a couple of minutes, but if anyone does have any instinctive questions, then please do feel free to ask. I'd be very happy to answer them. One there, I think, yeah. So that's not very helpful, just say there, but right there. I don't know how else to describe it.
Thank you. I believe you started with the idea that we often see Odysseus as just a straight villain. How do you think, say in 5th century Athens, they would have seen Odysseus? Because Aristotle's summary of the Odyssey didn't seem to put any kind of negative spin on Odysseus.
Yeah, good question. I mean, obviously, they, in any period, is a very broad, there could have been many different responses to Odysseus in an Athenian audience as there might be to this room. What we can really judge by, and you're right, Aristotle's summary is not, well, in that part, it's not negative Odysseus. I think it's a bit negative to the Odyssey. It doesn't do it justice. I briefly mentioned that Athenian tragedy often characterises Odysseus much more by his deeds, and some of those deeds are brutal. He does mastermind quite a lot of what would be considered to be war crimes. But there was also sort of one other model is that the Stoic philosophers, for example, saw in Odysseus a potential kind of prototype, because there are often times where Odysseus doesn't react violently or angrily and sort of maintains his composure, and that could have been seen as a model for Stoicism. So many, many different interpretations depending on where one's angle is. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the speech. There had been scholars pointing out that self-sufficiency fundamentally doesn't exist because everything is under divine intervention. Is Odysseus the same as, for example, Achilles in terms of being influenced by divine intervention? Do they both lack self-sufficiency? Thank you.
Thanks. And yes, that's a really huge question that if we have a system which ancient epic never denies, that the gods are, as it were, in control, there's a plan of Zeus, where is there room for any kind of heroic agency? That, in a sense, is a truism that the epics deliberately don't resolve. So one of my versions of thinking about it is that we wouldn't need 24 books of the Iliad or the Odyssey were it not for these characters. And there are many, I've done hundreds of tutorials on the role of the gods, and I've never had quite the same discussion in one or the other, but the relationship between human and divine, not just in terms of their friendships, you're right, but in terms of control, I deeply believe, and it's ultimately deliberately never resolved. And so it's up to us, and in terms of our own ethics as we read, in terms of the emphasis we place on humans' ability to change, for example, decisions along the way, if not the ultimate outcome. It depends on where we fall on that spectrum.
Thank you. You talked about how you can use the original Greek to discover a lot about characters, and through the language you can discover a lot about characters. Do you think you can only get the full experience of the Odyssey or the Iliad if you read it in the ancient Greek?
That's a great question. Now, you're asking me, and I think that everybody's answer has a right to be, what we're doing here is the humanities, what we're doing here is subjects that we are allowed to be subjective in our passions. So I think that you get the full richness of it through the Greek. I think that translations themselves, as works of art in their own right, can be fantastic. If you come up to me afterwards, I'm very happy to tell you the translations that I like the best. I read in translation all the time. I certainly don't speak all the languages in the world. I love Gilgamesh. I don't know Akkadian yet. So, I'm fully immersed in the art of translation myself. Do it all the time. Translation is an art. I don't think that the Greek, I think that you can get something different from the Greek, that it doesn't rank better or worse, but the very fact that I spent so much time pushing on that word polytropos, and many devices, many turns, doesn't quite cut it. So I think translation in itself is an art form, but there are many, many things that cannot be fully translated. And so getting them in their own right for example, the first line of the Antigone, which is a play that I absolutely love, it's untranslatable, and I would go so far as to say it's untranslatable. Have a look at, even many of you who don't know Greek, if and when you do, and that's partly to do with the fact that what Sophocles does there is play on the idea that words run into one another, because it's a play all about incestuous families that can't be separated. So he uses words that are kind of synonyms, but you can't pull them apart because they're trying to describe something that can't be described. So look, I'm a huge fan of language as well as languages and how language works. And that can be done through translation, but oh my God, can it be done through the Greek? I've probably only got, I sound like I'm some kind of stand-up comic. I'm here all day. I'm manning the classics and modern languages. manning, womaning the classics and modern languages stall. I'm happy to talk also about the Odyssey. I'm happy always to talk about the Odyssey. So if we just take maybe one more question, then I'll finally give up the stage to my dear colleague, friend and former teacher, David, over here, who can talk more about Latin literature. Front, yeah, just because it's closest.
I got...
Oh, sorry, I'm probably queue jumping here. Whoever... Yeah, oh, sorry, Mike there, yeah, go.
Thank you. I know you say that you're interested in the Bible and the Christian view in the Greek world. I wonder if, because I know the early church fathers were sort of soaked in Greek culture, what do they say about Homer and heroes in general?
Oh, that's a big one. Again, the church fathers say a huge number of different things. One of my big research questions at the moment is how the idea of something being canonical, so a text that was so revered, so widely read, interacts with the idea of the sacred. And church fathers obviously were very much connected to a holy text which had its own profound set of canonical value, but also scriptural value. So the writings of the church fathers, which also, I mean, one thing I think is worth saying, church fathers wrote some great poetry as well, in Greek, very influenced by Homer as a poet. But they're a really interesting intersection to how we navigate something that is canonical versus how we navigate something that is scriptural. Yeah, and I'm still working on what that navigation means. If you want to come up to me just straight, person in the black, if you want to come up straight at the end, we'll let David talk then. But anyway, thank you for being such a great audience. And yeah, sorry.
Yep, that's good. And then if we scroll to the top, golden. Brilliant. Okay, well, hello everyone. If you're heading out of the room, that's fine. There are lots of stalls behind and beneath the lecture room for you to ask questions. If you are staying, let's make sure you've signed up to the right thing. It'll be me, again, talking about Lucretius and the book that solves your life. For those watching online, I'll be scrolling through the two-page handout. But for those in the room, I've gone old school, and I've got a physical, tangible handout for you to have in your hands, to draw on, write on, dispose of as the fancy takes you. But if you could raise your hand, if you haven't seen any handouts, they've probably got clogged up somewhere. So there's no handouts there or here. I'll get some in motion. And if anyone's sitting on a pile of 50-odd handouts, do let them do the rounds. So put these here. If you could send those through that group. You've got some there. Handouted. Oh, not you two. There we go. Any others for handouts? It's a very exciting handout. There you go. Lovely, lovely. Okay. Hopefully that will do us. Right, so, hello. There you go. All right. Here as well. Last two in the building. Yeah, if you just leave those there, maybe someone will come and get them. So, the title of the talk, as advertised, was to lure you in. I didn't use the word Lucretius. I let it be a mystery as to what book will solve your life. And that does seem a rather cocksure, rather arrogant title for a work of literature, a book that claims to save your life. But my hope in the next 20 minutes or so is to convince you not just that that is indeed the purpose of this remarkable poem, but actually that, although it was written over 2,000 years ago, as a work of literature about the human condition, it still has valuable things either to teach us or to make us think about our assumptions in the modern world in which we live. Today, if you went to the bookshop and found the self-help literature section, you probably know the sort of things you're going to get. A sort of popular philosophy written in prose offering you apparently easy solutions to the eternal problems of being a human and living our lives. But in the ancient world, there was a much more intimate mixture between philosophy and literature. And the remarkable thing about this poem we'll be talking about is that it does seek to change your life, but it's written as a poem. Some of you may have heard of Lucretius. You may have heard of his one work, which I'm talking about, the so-called De Rerum Natura. But even if you've heard nothing of the man, you will find many things in his poem that resonate with you. So just in brief, to kick us off, we're talking about a man who we know lived in the 1st century BC. He was clearly in Rome. He was clearly well educated, but beyond that, we know almost nothing. No one talks about him. No one writes about his life. He appears to have lived for a few decades and then disappears. But he leaves behind this huge 6-book epic, which we call didactic. Does anyone know what the word didactic means? Yes, audience interaction. With the purpose of teaching. Couldn't have put it better myself, sir. Exactly. It's a book that seeks to teach you about what? Well, about the nature of everything, okay? De Rerum Natura as a title, which you'll see later on, doesn't mean on the nature of things. It means why everything is as it is. And therefore the poem, as we'll see very shortly, starts with physics and focuses on science before moving to the human body and the world around us. It's a long poem. It's 7,500 lines long. And although it is posed as a lesson, it actually has a stated pupil, someone called Gaius Memmius, who in modern parlance would be a successful politician in the elite networks of society. Was he a friend of Lucretius's? Or was Lucretius trying to make his poem do the rounds by addressing it to a famous figure? We just don't know. But we do know that Gaius Memmius was not a devotee of the philosophy that we'll be looking at. So Lucretius really does want to change the life of at least one individual, but his hope is that you as a fellow reader will be carried along to the truths he teaches as well. The other thing to say at the outset is that Lucretius is a hardline Epicurean. That is to say, this Greek philosopher Epicurus is, in Lucretius's view, the man who has solved the problems of what it is to live. Epicurus, as you may know, is a Greek philosopher based at Athens a couple of centuries earlier, but Lucretius, in his Latin poem, seeks to versify and pitch to the world those Greek ideas. So, under item 2, you have a brief sketch of what the lesson looks like. And you'll see that it moves from the literally microscopic on a bigger and bigger range until it's at the macroscopic level of the universe around us. And the reason it starts microscopic is that one of the core features of Epicureanism was that atoms exist. Now, almost all of us, if not all of us, take it for granted that atoms are true science. They've always been there, they always will be there, and they are the building blocks of the matter of our world. Well, although the ancient Greeks invented the idea of the atom, it was an outlandish idea that very few people bought into. Most people thought that the so-called atomists were thinkers who had lost the plot, just gone a bit mad, come up with this idea that there are these tiny particles which can't be cut, but you can't actually see them because they're beneath the realm of vision. It's a very counterintuitive idea. So the atomists were thought to be strange individuals who had gone down the wrong path. But it's vital, as we'll see, for Epicurus and Lucretius, that we operate with a binary distinction. The world is made of stuff and not stuff, void, emptiness, inanity. And so in the first book, all it's doing is showing how before the time of Plato and Socrates, everyone was wrong. All of those early philosophers and scientists talking about immaterial matter, nonsense. What's immaterial matter, for a start? That would be a good point. But in the poem itself, once we've set out this binary distinction, Book 2 is all about atoms and how they come together and make literally everything we can see and can't see in the world around us. Still technical science then, but in Book 3, we come to the human body. And Epicureans, like most people, regard humans as somehow special. It's manifest that there's something about us, something about our cognitive power, which does set us apart from other living creatures. Yes, that's a human-centric view, but it's a very common one throughout cultures. And in Book 3, Lucretius dismisses some of the mystery about humans. He says, yes, we have a soul. That is the thing within us that makes us us as individuals, but it is nothing special. It's just atoms. Atoms woven together for the span of your life. Now, the flip side to that is a really important one for the Greek or the Roman, because if we are made of nothing more special than atoms, when we die, the atoms that make us up break apart. There is no soul to survive that breakup because it too is made up of the same matter. So, the whole world of the afterlife or the possibility of being reincarnated, which some ancient philosophers believed in, is nonsense for the Epicurean. You have one life, and that is your single mortal span. Book 4 talks about how the various clever things our bodies can do, hear, dream, see, all of these things operate in an atomic way. And Lucretius's main aim is to show that everything can be understood through physics. Book 5, we leave humans behind and we look at where our world came from, how it operates by the seasons, by day and night, how the heavens operate, and indeed we have a huge account of the anthropological history of human beings. The TLDR on that is effectively humans are special, but we're just the least bad thing that's evolved, okay? We're random creations, but our random creation can handle the world around us better than the other ones. But no one created us and no one designed us. Finally, Book 6 looks at some other things which were traditionally associated with the gods and divine punishment, lightning, earthquakes, that kind of thing. Again, Lucretius says these are natural processes of the physical world around us. So that's the lesson, and it doesn't have a lot of what we call ethics. It doesn't have a lot telling us how to live our lives. But you can see that the consequences of the physics are massive, because they mean our one life is the only time where we can be ourselves and impinge upon others. And that was a very controversial view in antiquity. Under item 3, you've got a brief summary of Epicurus, who came up with the doctrines I just summarized. And frustratingly, but as classicists, we face this all the time, his 37-book encyclopedia describing the whole universe is lost. All we have are some carbonized fragments from when Mount Vesuvius conveniently erupted and set them in a different physical form that survives to us. So Epicurus is mostly gone, and we reconstruct his thoughts through this poem. Just this last bullet point under item 3, the shared mission of Epicurus and Lucretius is simple but massive: to free humankind from mental pain. Yes, we all have physical pain, that's part of being a physical organism, but that's a lesser pain compared to the enduring agony of failing to understand the universe around us. So, the main thing on the handout is item 4, which has in 8 easily digestible points the core tenets of how the Epicurean views the world. Maybe some of these will resonate with you personally, maybe they'll all seem ridiculous, but all of them deal with major questions which simply won't go away. We can't wish these big questions away. So firstly, first thing I've already mentioned is that the universe is only made up of stuff and not stuff. Simple. But that means there's nothing special lurking between matter and non-matter. That means our soul, however special it is corporeal and mortal. It's made of stuff and will break apart when we die. That will be the end of us. So, item 3, the afterlife is just as non-existent as pre-life existence. I don't know whether you've ever speculated on what the universe was like when you did not exist, but it's quite a profound thought to think of not in a sort of selfish way, like, how did the world cope without me? I mean, thinking about a time where your essence didn't exist. It's quite a striking thought. So, what do you do in your one life if that's all you've got? You seek out pleasure. Now, that sounds literally hedonistic in a sort of sex, drugs, rock and roll way of you're trying to get as many pleasures as fast as possible. But that's not the way to conceive of Epicurean pleasure. As you can see, the ultimate pleasure is the total removal of pain, this state called ataraxia, which is a bit like a sort of Zen state in Buddhism, where by virtue of understanding the world around you entirely, you have no nagging doubts or harmful thoughts, you are at peace. The consequence of that is that once you've reached that state, you can't get any happier, you can't have any more pleasure. All you can do is vary that state through philosophical conversation. What about the gods in all of this? Well, it sounded quite atheistic so far, insofar as the gods didn't create us, and we're not spending time worrying about them. But interestingly, the Epicureans did believe in the gods, but crucially, they are disinterested in our universe. They live between universes, and they've frankly just got better things to be doing with themselves than worrying about humankind. So, they simply do not interact with our universe. That may be your own personal belief, but in antiquity, the whole of Greek and Roman society was based around persuading the gods to favour you, and trying to avoid vengeful punishment from the gods based upon your deeds. That was at the heart of ancient society. In the world of Epicureanism, it's a waste of time to get involved in religion or superstition. It's just irrelevant. What about free will? If we are made up of atoms bouncing around within us, which follow the laws of physics, doesn't that mean whatever we do actually isn't genuine free will? It's predetermined by the physical interaction of these atoms. Well, for the first inventors of atomism, Democritus, Leucippus, these Greek guys, they had to conclude that, okay, yeah, free will is a mirage. We feel as though we're in charge, but actually we're in a deterministic, fated universe. Epicurus breaks out of that by a very complicated theory, which implies that within us, our soul can redirect atoms and thus start a new chain of events. So the headline on item 6, we do have free will despite what I've said. Item 7, controversial too. Politics is a waste of time. Maybe you already know that. All political careers end in failure and or death. But in the ancient world, that was the done thing for men. In the world of Epicureanism, you've just got to keep all politics at arm's length. Finally then, what do you do with your life once you've reached this state of Zen-like pleasure? You engage in the two good things, philosophical debate and friendship. You form your own coterie and you effectively have an intellectual society until your final day comes. Well, those are the fundamental principles of Epicureanism, and this book, over 7,500 lines, tries to sell them to you. And on the other side of the handouts, I've just got a few passages that you may want to look into, which give you not just a sense of what the poem is about, but also the tone at which it operates. It is a supremely self-confident philosophical poem, as well as strikingly beautiful. Whatever your aesthetic tastes, Lucretius's poem is famous for the striking clarity and beauty of its Latin verses. So you've got Latin on the left, English on the right, translating it. And under item 5, we've got Lucretius celebrating the transformational power of this Epicurus figure. We're told that human life was grovelling in a terrible state under the oppression of religio. And this figure of religion is personified as an evil goddess, overlooking humankind and somehow suppressing them. But in line 66, an unnamed Greek bloke, Graios Homor, dares Ausos to raise his eyes against heaven. He's not afraid of the reputation of the gods, nor their thunderbolts, their lightning, etc. Instead, the bravery of his mind breaks through the chains of the universe, and his mind is able to wander beyond the flaming walls of the universe, and through his own thought, intellectually, he tours the infinite worlds of the universe through his own prowess. So it's not messing about in terms of how high-flown the praise is, it's genuinely hero worship. But for Lucretius, this one-man Epicurus managed to transcend the ignorance of humanity. A bit later in Book 1, under item 6, Lucretius is honest about how difficult his job is, because he's basically writing a physics textbook in a new language, Latin instead of Greek, and in very technical, very difficult to write poetry. And he says, as you can see, that these obscure discoveries of the Greeks are hard to illuminate in Latin poetry. Why is that? He needs nova verba, he needs new words, new technical terms, but Latin's really poor. It's got an agestas of relevant terminology. But because of his excitement about friendship with Memmius, he's prepared to pull these all-nighters, work really hard on it, and set before the reader these clara lumina, these bright lights of eternal truth. Well, after that intro, we get into the science, and it's quite a slog, the next 800 lines, hammering home repeatedly how there's nothing other than matter and non-matter. But after about 800 lines, we get to a very famous metaphor, where Lucretius explains why he's doing what he's doing. And he's very candid about the process. He takes us first to the world of a doctor's surgery and says how doctors, medentes, often have to coat the rim of the cup in which they put bitter wormwood, a very hard-to-drink medicinal liquid, with honey. And the honey lures the pueri, the young children, into drinking it. And he says, okay, they're a bit tricked, but they're not quite deceived in doing this, but they end up drinking the bitter liquid. He then says, look, sic ego nunc. That's what I'm doing, guys. Because I'm aware that haec ratio, this philosophy of Epicureanism, to most people seems tristior. It just seems a little too tough. The various tenets we went through, it's hard for anyone to swallow those literally. So I've created a beautiful poem so that you will hopefully keep reading for its poetic honey and thereby swallow the difficult truths of the philosophy. Well, at the bottom of your handout, you've got the last two paragraphs, 8 and 9, from books 2 and 3. And the only point I want to end with in those is to show you how this idea that you as readers are like children. You're uninitiated individuals who could be fully adults, but because you haven't had the breakthrough of seeing Epicureanism, you are like children who are frightened in the dark and don't understand the world around them. But read on, and my poem will sort you out. And really the climax of the book, this is the last thing I'll say, is under item 9, where we have 27 arguments for why our soul is mortal and will die with us. But Lucretius is so confident in his philosophy that he's able to say after that argument that death should be nothing to us. It shouldn't even be something that troubles us, and it doesn't matter for us because we are simply mortal. He tries to flesh that out in a way that's both aggressive and to some degree convincing, but he flips round the typical view of hell and says all of those stories about what's happening in the underworld, they are real, but they're real in our day-to-day life. We make a hell on earth for ourselves by failing to understand the universe around us. So that's all my time will allow in terms of introducing you to this remarkable poem. And I do hope that if you've got a chance to read it in translation or in Latin, you give it a look. It is like no other poem. It's one of the most controversial poems ever written, for reasons you can understand in a largely Christian culture that comes soon after, but it's something that I do hope you will have a chance to look at some point. Now, I'll stop talking at this point, and probably we can take one or two questions thereabouts, but I will be around in case you'd like to ask anything in private. So we've got a couple here, if that works. Yeah.
What would you say are the biggest contrasts between Epicureanism and Stoicism?
Okay, so Stoicism is another major Hellenistic philosophy. Epicureanism and Stoicism have a similar attitude to how we should live our lives in terms of understanding the universe, finding peace through that. But the two major differences, for Stoics, everything is fated. God is in everything and God knows everything, so we've got to sort of go along with the universe. And also, they don't believe in atomism at all. They believe that your soul has a sort of eternal scope for existence in a way that you've only got the single life in Epicureanism. And then, yep, just end here. Thank you very much.
Do you think that Epicurus had actually achieved ataraxia, or do you think, well, at least do you think he thought he had?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and the distinction you make is a very intelligent one. One could feel that one is ataraxic, but in actuality isn't. We have an anecdote that at the end of Epicurus's life, he was in extreme pain. His natural death was a very painful one, but he recorded at the time that his reflection both on the truths of philosophy and on past conversation with friends was able to allow him to transcend his physical pain and die at what he regarded as peace. So whether that's just big talk or whether that was credible at the time, I don't know, but certainly he felt as though he had solved the problems of the universe and of his life. Okay, well, my time is up, I'm afraid, everyone. We have another great lecture coming afterwards, if you would like to stay in here. If not, do go to the stalls and speak to us. Do email me if there's anything you want to raise on the handout, but otherwise, thank you very much.
Is this?
Hello, can you hear me? Testing? Yeah, excellent. Right, I think I'm going to get started because we're running a little bit behind and I've got lots that I want to talk to you about. So, hello everyone. Lovely to see you here today. My name's Rachel Wood and I'm a lecturer in classical archaeology at Oxford. I specialise in particular on art and religion in ancient Iran, although quite a broad conception, not necessarily confined to the modern country. And what I would like to talk to you today is going a little bit further east than you may be familiar with. You might be thinking, why on earth are we not talking about Greece and Rome? At a push, you might think classics is the ancient Mediterranean. Well, today we're going to Turkmenistan, going to Central Asia, to show you something slightly different. There's quite a hiss coming off this. Hopefully it's okay for you. And we're going to be looking at images of Greek gods that appear on a group of extremely expensive luxury drinking vessels. So the idea here is when you get to university, you may be exposed to a lot of group drinking. So here you can start thinking about what's the meaning behind those sorts of events, and the relationships that are forged by those types of behaviors. Right, so why are we going to Central Asia? Who are the Parthians? Absolutely fine. If you haven't heard of them before, that's what I'm here for today. So generally speaking, from a classical archaeologist perspective, we're coming at the Parthians from the perspective of the Hellenistic world. We're looking at the period after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, after his conquest of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, which extended all the way from the Ionian coast of the Aegean across to Central Asia and the borders of India. Alexander comes along, conquers that, and then after his death, we get various successor kingdoms. For our purposes, we're mostly talking about the Seleucids, the dynasty started by Seleucus I, who in the mid-3rd century are presented with this problem of the Parthians. They've also lost the territory further east in Bactria, which is modern Afghanistan, but at the same time, in Parthia, this region that is roughly circled by this orange line, this region also seems to break away from Seleucid control at that time. We hear that a man called Arsaces, whose coinage this belongs to at the bottom, he united the tribes of a people called the Dahai, or the Pani, who were based around that area. But Parthia had been an Achaemenid Persian satrapy, so a region of their empire, and then it was a Seleucid one. And around this time, it breaks away and it's independent. And what I would like to present to you today is to think about how do we talk about the Hellenistic world? Where do we cut off? Because sort of a bugbear of mine is that if we stick to the precise borders of the Seleucid Empire, even talking about borders is a bit iffy at this stage, you lose a lot. And Eurocentrism is something that we contend with constantly in the study of the classical world. But if you look at it from the perspective of who is ruling, then that's really reinforcing that problem. So how do we get the Parthians into this dialogue of the Hellenistic world is a tricky one, particularly as the sources are not as expansive as those for the Mediterranean. Both the literary sources, the textual sources, and also the archaeology is far more patchy for the Parthian Empire than we might like. So the Parthian Empire, we've just been looking at the mid-3rd century when Arsaces I establishes his independent control of the territory, and the Seleucids more or less give up control of that. But it's about 100 years later, circa 141, mid-2nd century BC, that the Parthians managed to expand out of Parthia and establish what we term today as the Parthian Empire. And you may have come across these most notably in the very famous Prima Porta statue of Augustus, where on his cuirass, his breastplate, it's embossed with these figures that represent the return of the standards, the military standards lost by Crassus at the Battle of Carrhae, which you can see marked on the map over in the west of the Parthian Empire there, back in 53 BC. So even decades later, in the reign of Augustus, the relationships with the Parthians was really vital and important. There's a massive contested region around Syria in particular. So that's where you may have heard of these. I include this half reconstruction of the polychromy, the coloured paint on the statue, so that you can see the figures pop out more brightly, but it's a reconstruction, obviously. Right. So that's the scope of the Parthian Empire, but we are focusing in this very short lecture on Parthia itself, on what's referred to as a capital of Old Nisa. So you can see Nisa marked there. We're looking at Old Nisa, which is a fortified citadel. It's quite near to a larger settlement, which we refer to as New Nisa, which seems to have been the city itself. And we're looking here at some sort of fortified royal ceremonial building, site. And the reason I'm using those vague terms is because it is quite vague. We don't really know what was going on there, which is part of the interest in studying it. So we're going from the reign of Achilles I. Don't get confused when you look at the coins. All of the Parthian kings refer to themselves as Arsaces on their coinage, which is very selfish of them, if you ask me. But we are looking in particular at Mithridates I, who in the 2nd century BC was responsible for this huge expansion of Parthian hegemony. And you can see there, this is just a brief illustration of how dramatically his imperial image changes on his coinage, how the ruler representation changes drastically. So on that coin at the top, you can see a left-facing profile bust of the ruler on the obverse of the coin in this soft hat, which is very typical of Parthian costume, Parthian clothing. And in some ways it refers to their nomadic heritage, because Achilles I had supposedly united these nomadic tribes and settled them there. And in this first coin of Mithridates I, you can see that he's repeating that imagery, modifying it slightly. And in both images, you can see the diadem that's been tied around the head, which is a signifier in the grand scheme of the Hellenistic world of kingship as well. So they're combining the two there. And yet, when Mithridates I conquers Seleucia on the Tigris, which we'll try and use this, is here. So in the heartlands of the Seleucid Empire, his image becomes very different. The die is carved the other way round, so he ends up facing the other way. He's no longer wearing the hat. You can see the diadem plain and clear, and he's got this full beard. And on the other side of the coin is no longer the seated figure who may be a royal figure. He's an archer of some sort, again, very ambiguous. But now you have a walking Heracles, the Greek god, even. Right. And so coins and also a few sites like this are some of our main sources for the Parthian Empire. And we get this major, quite distinct shift in the 2nd century BC. What is going on? And it's in the mid-2nd century BC that we seem to have this site being built. We've got a huge monumental complex of buildings with very unusual architecture, built in this fortified site that dominates a plain in the southern part of Turkmenistan, near the border with Iran, in modern terms. And from a couple of sherds, potsherds, found at the site, it seems to have been known as Mithridatkert, the fortress of Mithridates. So this is a big statement being made back in Parthia in the mid-2nd century by Mithridates I. what we're going to look at in particular, lost it again, there we go, is this group of ivory drinking horns, or rhytons, or writer, if you prefer, which were found in the square building at the north of the site. They were first excavated in 1948 and more recently restudied again using modern techniques to look at how, in particular, they were made. I will come back to this head, don't worry. So there we are. Many of them are very fragmentary indeed, so there seems to be roughly 40 to 50 of them, perhaps, and they range in size from, say, 30 to 60 centimeters high. They could hold varying amounts from half a litre of liquid to 1.5 litres. And as you can see, they're made from ivory, which in itself is a very precious material and very difficult to work with as well. So this isn't, although it's the shape of a tusk, an elephant's tusk, it's not actually, they've recarved it, reshaped it out of several parts to create this image, to create this object, rather. And it's fixed together with probably wooden or bronze pins, and originally painted, and also with inlaid precious stones as well. Not only that, but as you can see here, the terminal, or the protome, we also call it, the tip of the drinking horn, usually takes the shape of a fantastical creature, some sort of mythological beast. There's a whole range of them that I'll show you. And then around the top, which is often studded with heads or semi-precious stones, no longer extant, underneath that is a frieze, often bearing figural designs, many of which show the 12 Olympian gods. So these are extremely expensive luxury goods for mass drinking of wine. This is not a subtle little cup or a little bottle like this. This is for some sort of grand occasion. They seem to have been made locally, although studies of the material suggest that actually these are from African elephants rather than Indian elephants, so even further away, suggesting the reach and expanse of the Parthian Empire. And as you might be able to make out in this image here, some of these figures you probably recognize. So for example, we've got Athena up here with her helmet, shield and spear. We've got Zeus here with his thunderbolt. And we've got a whole range. And here, the seated one is even named Hestia. So there's been a lot of questions about who are these conceived of in a Parthian setting? Are the Parthians worshipping Greek gods? What's going on here? Why are these on these vessels? If we look at other objects from Old Nysa, we can see a lot of high-end artifacts that were stored there. Again, storing is a bit of a tricky one because the square house where these were found, we don't really know the function of the building. And we'll come back to that and show you it a bit more. But these were mostly found in that square house, as it's called. So we've got statuettes, which might be Hecate. We've got gilded silver, even smaller statuettes of Athena and Eros, and this Aphrodite figure as well. And this clay head that you see here, you might be able to see that it's got Zeus's thunderbolt on the cheek flap of the helmet. So you've got plenty of Greek iconography connected to the Greek gods here. So what's going on? Later, and when by later, I mean 1st century BC and the next centuries, we do have evidence for the iconography of Greek gods being reinterpreted to represent Iranian gods. So for example, Heracles in particular, his image is very popular, repurposed in a number of situations, but also some others as well. But in the mid-2nd century BC, and specifically on these rhytons, what's happening there. Is it some form of religious syncretism? What I wanted to show you about this one was although you've got some which are very clearly, no, that's not working, clearly identifiable like this, and sort of standard or canonical, there are also some adaptations made. So, for example, there's an image of Hera who has this winged helmet. And there's also Dionysiac scenes and scenes of Greek education. So it's not complete. You might come across the term misunderstandings, that they've seen these images and they're reapplying them and they're adapting them and changing them because they don't really know what they're meant to be, which arguably is not the case here. So, for example, that question about misunderstandings, if we look at this gilded silver plate that's in the British Museum here, we've got a reclining figure with a bowl who could be Dionysus or could be Heracles, because he's also shown like that. And then if you look at the figure on the right, hopefully you can make out from there, that little skipping, dancing figure is carrying a club and a lion skin. Well, that's usually how a satyr might be represented in the Hellenistic period, but he's holding the attributes of Heracles. So is that meant to be Heracles, or is Heracles chilling out on the couch there and this satyr behind him is holding his attributes? Either way, it's a very clear engagement with Greek art for these high-end luxury drinking vessels. So going back to the ivory writer, here's some details. So you can see we've got images of education, so that middle one, for example, Dionysiac scenes, and a host of different shaped tips to these drinking horns. And these drinking horns are emulating, in a way, the more common version that we find made of precious metal, most commonly gilded silver, such as this one in the Met in New York, which is probably Parthian. So here you have a detail of a centaur who's carrying a woman on his shoulder. So these are very finely decorated, and there's a lot of time and care gone into these. And yet they seem to have been made not in one go. So I said there's a range of sizes, but they also seem to be made across some decades, from maybe the mid-2nd century BC to the mid-1st century BC. And what are we to make of this shape in the first place? We've got a lot of precedents for this type of shape. It's a very awkward shape to drink from. I don't know if, for the adults in the audience, if you've been to a party where you have to hold onto your glass because you're holding it, then you tend to drink a lot more than if you can put your glass down. These, similarly, you have to hold it. They have their own stand. But this is for some serious drinking. This isn't a dinner accompanied by a drink. And you might often come across rhytons being referred to as an Iranian or a Persian type of vessel. But by the Hellenistic period, does that apply so much? So you've got just an assortment of quick examples that I put together here. An Achaemenid Persian silver rhyton there from the 5th century BC. But also these shapes, these forms of vessel were being used in the Greek world as well. So I show you this rather cute ceramic version from Athens in the shape of a dog's head. And when we get into the Hellenistic world, these really are part of elite display and behavior. This is what the wealthy do. So on this section of a frieze, of wall painting on the facade of a tomb at Agios Athanasios in Macedonia, you can see a symposium, a drinking party, and there's a figure in the middle who's holding up a gilded silver rhyton with a protome, or the tip, in the shape of a winged beast. And he's the center of the whole frieze. This is the centerpiece. It's the main deal. And this needs to be seen in the context of Alexander's conquest and the capture of a huge amount of gold and silver from the Achaemenid Persian treasuries brought back to Macedonia. This newfound wealth in, 5 minutes, okay. I've been going too slowly, sorry. Newfound wealth at the end of the 4th century. And it's not just a Greek or an Iranian or Persian thing. You also have it spreading across the Greek world and the ancient world as well. It's bound up in these ideals of trophy, of luxury, to be something to want. Right, I'll skip that bit. In the square house, we also found fragments of ivory furniture as well. So some have argued that it was in the square house that the dining took place. But the buildings at Old Nisa are rather ambiguous. They can clearly cater for a lot of people, and they're very impressive in a range of different shapes and heavily decorated. So you get an idea here how Greek forms, such as the acanthus leaves that evoke the Corinthian capitals that you might be familiar with, are adapted and used, created out of terracotta. And you get symbols such as Heracles' club being used in the architecture alongside features that recall Parthian heritage of the bow, which is so important in Iranian culture. I'll skip through this bit for time. And here, this is an example of this very high-end art that is being produced for the Parthians, for this royal space. It's in unbaked clay, which is the local form of sculpture, but very much part of Hellenistic art. These faces are full of pathos and dynamism, which is very much how we think of Hellenistic art. And it's around this time in the mid-2nd century that the Parthians are still competing with the Seleucids. They need to present their new form of royal authority, which, if you think about what dining is for, it's where you get a group of people together and you reinforce the bonds between each other over drinks. But these ivory write-ons, they're not made to be drunk out of by hand. They have a hole in the bottom and they're to serve the liquid from. So if you are there and you are drinking with the king, you are being served from these very elaborate vessels that allude to a much wider world, both in their materiality and in the decoration on them. Then it really says something about your status, your connection to the king, and the status of the Parthian Empire as well. And in order to wrap up in time, so I've jumped over quite a lot there, what the key sort of elephant in the room, as it were, no pun intended, here is that if we try and bring the Parthians into dialogue with the Hellenistic world, then it has been said that this is undermining the agency of the Parthians. That then it's saying, oh, well, they're doing Greek things. So it's wiping out what they're trying to do. But arguably, if you leave them out of the picture, then you talk about what the Macedonians do, what the Greeks do, and you get a very blinkered view of what is going on. It's reinforced because on some of these coins that you get, to be fair, that one's quite hard to read. I should have mentioned this earlier with the earlier coin. You get the epithet Philhellene. The Parthians themselves are promoting themselves as lovers of Greek culture. And rather than a sort of subservient, unthinking response to Greek culture, we can see at Old Nisa how they are using it to present themselves as kings in this sort of super-regional visual language of display and behaviour. And I've missed out quite a lot there, but in order to keep to time, I will be good and stop. Have we got time for a question? I've lost time for 2 questions. Excellent. Okay. Does anyone have any questions after that? Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is there also some corresponding literature? So I think.
So the question was, are there any corresponding literary sources that we can use alongside these? There are a few, mostly in Greek and Latin texts. The Parthian written record is negligible. There's hardly anything. There's a few scattered potsherds, for example. And so it gives us a very bitty view. And that is part of why this sort of material has been neglected, is because they're seen as promoting themselves as very Greek in the 2nd century BC, which is happily lines up with when we have sources for what they're doing. And then as they become more Iranian looking, that aligns with a sort of dip in the number of sources that we have. And so there's a conception of a dark age that corresponds to a possible Iranian revival in the art. So the short answer is there aren't many, but there are some. But that is part of what's led to the construction of a narrative of the very Greek early Parthians to a rejection of Greek culture later on. Any other questions?
Yeah. Does the Parthians' interest in Greek culture link to the fact that they're part of the first Silk Road and the trade from the east to the west?
I think it might. It's a really interesting question. I think it very much would be encouraged by their key strategic point, which really encourages connections and trade routes, and that in turn adds to the prosperity of the empire. Yes, and there are sources for travellers from Sri Lanka, I think, ending up in the Parthian Empire and wondering whether to go on to Rome or not. I think more specifically, coming at it from a Parthian royal angle, from an Arsacid dynastic angle, I think it was very useful for them to present themselves as equals to the Seleucids and other contenders to royal power. But I think there's extra connotations of trophy and other aspects that added to the appeal. Yes, thank you. Great, I will stop there. Thank you for your attention. And I'm very happy to answer any questions later, or about whether about this or about classical archaeology and ancient history at Oxford. Thank you.
You want to make it smaller? Or how can I mark anything on it? No, you can't mark, but you have a pointer. You can point.
It's not that bright.
I know, it's not that good. You need to open it, not through the reader to mark it.
Yeah. It needs to be
Okay,
in the PowerPoint,
well, I'll just address it right away.
Put the microphone on.
Yes. Thank you. There you go. Thank you. So see, the green light means it's on. If you want to turn it off, just push the button up. Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay, hi and welcome everyone to a brief taster lecture on the actor's voice in Greek tragedy. My name is Rebecca Laemmle, and I teach Greek literature here in Cambridge. And I should know better than to make slides with so much information on them. On the other hand, you better learn right away that there's a lot of text involved in the work we do. I must confess this was originally conceived of as a handout, but then due to some technical issues, we decided to just share it with you on screen. You have my contact details in the upper end, so anyone who wants the handout, who would like a copy, is very welcome to email me and I'll send it to you. However, it is not, we are going to skip through this quite rapidly. There's a couple of passages, and it's more about making a general point. So, actors. What do we know about the profession of actors in ancient Greek theatre? I'm going to focus mainly today on what I think is what you most likely know from your different courses in school, namely the Athenian theatrical festivals, the Great Dionysia on the one hand and the Laemmle festival on the other, which are for us the two festivals for which we have the most evidence for theatrical activity. There's of course a lot more in all kinds of places all over the Greek world, expanding as time goes along. But for today, we'll focus on Athens. Now, here on this, it's really just the first slide that is a bit awful. One type of evidence from which we derive a lot of information and actually what happened and when at these festivals derives from inscriptions. So the Greeks are known to have had a so-called epigraphical habit, the habit of chiseling a lot of information on stone, making a lot of records of all kinds of things. Now, one type of records pertains to what actually happened at theatrical festivals. And for this, there are three main types of such inscriptions called the fasti, a year-by-year listing of the outcome of the dithyrambic and dramatic competitions at the city Dionysia. Then we have the so-called didaskaliae, you may have heard that before, which are inscriptions offering complete records of tragedies and comedies performed at the city Dionysia and the Laemmle. And then finally, we have victor lists. And for our question today, which I want to focus on actors and the profession of the actor, the voice in particular, this is actually the most interesting list because here we have different sets of listing inter alia under point 2 here. Can you see this hand? I'm told the red pointer thing isn't working. We have tragic actors victorious at the Laemmle. We have comic actors victorious at the city Dionysia, and so on. So different categories, names, and then also accounts of careers. So once an actor is mentioned, we get a catalogue of the victories he may have had at different festivals in different years. So that is just one type of evidence that we can draw on when we want to know, well, how did the actor's trade develop in course of time? So now to give you just an impression of how such inscriptions looked, here's what we have now. Right? This is just a visual impression. This is a few fragments of the so-called fasti inscription. Now, here, on the next page, I'm scrolling down, is our idea of what this inscription originally looked like, right? So just to give you a sense of proportions, white is what we think must have been there, for all the years covered. And the grey areas, I mean, it's a bit like my brain after the pandemic. White is what I once knew, and grey is what I can now remember after all the homeschooling. But at any rate, I mean, this is also an important thing to note. In classics, we work in some way or other with fragments. We have little pieces and lots of blank that we need to try and fill, but also have the courage to admit it's just here. We drew a lot of blanks. And so this is just to give you a sense of proportion of how, of what was there and what we still have. Of course, there are many other sources with which we can supplement our knowledge of what actually happened at these festivals. But this is an important source. So here's the whole thing. There's another little bit here which is very important. We write a lot about fragment F. Anyway, so about actors, I mean, I had imagined a bit of a conversation, but that was before I knew that there would be a relatively full hall of people. I mean, who is on stage when a tragedy is performed? Has anyone got an idea? What do we need? Yes? And the chorus is how many people? Don't know. So, yeah? 12? Later 15. That's the usual number we work with, actually deriving from passages in the orbit of this here, of which I'm giving you a first chunk. This is Aristotle's hypothesis on the origins of tragedy and comedy. And at any rate, yes, you're right. So there's a dozen of chorus members, later enhanced to 15, and probably in the same time frame development, we have a rise from 2 actors to 3. Who else might be there, just for completeness sake? On stage, music. Don't forget, we tend to focus on the text only. That's obviously the only thing we have left. But there's not just a chorus singing and dancing and doing movements, but there's also music. Right? So at least a now-lost player will be on stage, and perhaps a couple of extras, right? Who wear costumes and masks representing someone without speaking. But now the passage here that I have chosen, which is a passage which is extremely important for all kinds of reasons. Here I've want to bring to your attention for the sole reason of this enhancement of actors that you already mentioned. So we have here the statement that Aeschylus innovated by having 2 actors rather than just 1, and Sophocles raised to 3. Now, behind this lies an idea that originally tragedy is a choral performance. The origin, at least according to Aristotle, is dithyrambic performances. That is a chorus activity of a group. And we have other information according to which initially the poet himself might have been the hypokrites. Now, what does that mean? What does the word literally mean? It's no longer reflected in if I say a hypocrite, I mean something else. But hypokrites is he who answers, who responds. So originally there's an idea of, presumably, of responding to the chorus. Hypokrites then becomes the technical term for the actor. So when I now accuse someone of being hypocritical, it's because of the artificiality, because he or she is playing, acting, is not being genuine. So at any rate, here in Aristotle, the claim, and this will not mean, it's not logical, for that we need to branch out a little bit. It is very unlikely that the actors themselves could have innovated in this manner. Now, why is it unlikely? Because what we have here, that's very, very important to always have in mind, we have competitions, right? All of these tragedies and satyr plays and comedies we have are contributions of a poet to a competition. And a competition that is highly regulated by all kinds of external factors, starting with the person who pays for the whole thing, right? Presumably for individual poets, for the chorus, the costumes, all the rehearsal work that goes into it. So there are different interests coalescing here, and the mere fact of it being a competition suggests that at least at any one time, competitions for each contender in the competition are the same. So you will not have one tragedian having 5 actors and the other working only with 2. 3 for everyone. In later time, as time progresses, this becomes even more regulated, that presumably the state actually allotted different actors to different playwrights. And why? Because more and more we see that beyond the poets' competition, right, which in early times is the main competition, it's poet against poet, who gets first prize, who is second, and who is the lousy third. But more and more we see that there are also on top of this actors' competitions, right? And precisely this too, the fact that as an actor you can apply for the best Oscar for whatever, the best male performer or even a supporting act, the process needs to be regulated. So that's why we can count with relatively stable numbers. So now just very briefly, the idea that initially was the poets themselves who were actors responding to their chorus is repeatedly addressed in all kinds of sources. Here I have a passage from Aristotle, from The Art of Rhetoric. In another passage, number 4, is from the Life of Sophocles, where we are told about the innovations of Sophocles. And again, here, an interesting detail, it says he abolished the poet's acting. So the idea that the poet was involved as an actor in the first place on account of his microphony, the microphonia. He had a weak voice. Now, this thing may well be just a crystallization of a historical fact, that roughly at the time where Sophocles was active, actors were separated from poets, right? Or that it was no longer the poets who would act. That is presumably what this means. Whether or not Sophocles had a honey sweet, I think, we know that too, but the weakness of his voice, God knows. We cannot say anything about the historical value of such a claim, although it is also said that he choked from an unripe grape that an actor gifted him, which seems to be another flourish dealing with this complex of rise of actors at the time. Now, for some time, and this is now really about, I thought I'd choose 2 plays, of which I hope that they are known to many of you from school, namely Sophocles' Antigone and Euripides' Bacchae. And I'm making a huge leap and leaving out all kinds of information that is also important, but I mean, it's supposed to be a taster lecture. If you want to know more, then come back. You're very welcome. So one thing we can do when we look at scripts, so we work with this relatively solid knowledge. Okay, a poet had 3 actors at his disposal for these plays. Now that, of course, has nothing to do with number of roles. A play can have, if you look at the beginning of plays, you often find a list of the kind of dramatis personae. There's quite a few, certainly many more than 3. So this means that one actor had to play more than one role per play. There are some exceptions, of course. If you have, for instance, Oedipus at Colonus, where the old man comes in onto the stage at the beginning of the play and then is there until he walks out to go and die, that will have been one actor for much the whole of the play. In other cases, there are lots of exits and entrances, allowing for quick dress change behind the scenes. Now, I find an extremely interesting case, that of the Antigone. Now, you can, of course, ask, well, how do we know? And I have to say, well, of course, we don't have evidence. We don't have any text saying this is how roles were distributed. But there are, plausible guesses that you can make, namely just by seeing who is on stage in which scene and in what combination. And there are plausible reconstructions of how roles may have been distributed. Now, in the case of the Antigone, we have Creon. I'm sorry, I'm Swiss, as you will have maybe found out, certainly not Anglophone, so I might mispronounce some things. But at any rate, so Creon, the king of Thebes, by far the longest role, including a very long segment of what I call song here, so lyric. It means it's a party, a lengthy stretch where he has to sing. This suggests that this is one role pretty much reserved for presumably the protagonist. The protagonistes is the technical term for the actor who has this kind of lead role in the play. Now, interestingly, if we look at what might the second actor have done, we see that is a role that has Antigone, also with a lyric section, so again, suggesting that this is someone who needs to have a range of his voice. And then Haemon, Tiresias, and Eurydice, the wife of Creon. Now, what's particularly striking about this is that it means that one and the same, that all the characters opposing Creon, the ruler in this play, will most likely have been impersonated by the same actor. Now, we don't know enough about the technicalities. How do different masks modulate or affect the voice? Did the actor wearing the Antigone mask sound different from the actor wearing the Haemon mask? We don't know enough detail. Was it recognizable? I think that just because some of these things remain unclear should not stop us from asking them, because it gives the play a completely different dimension, right? To think about things that we are likely to overlook, that we can't see on the simple texts we are facing. But this kind of delving into and thinking about, we always have to remember these are plays that were performed, they were staged. This is nothing for the bookshelf or the scroll Teucher which contain them, right? So now a second example, and maybe on the Antigone, I would just like to say, this is one of the most reperformed Greek tragedies of all time. And it's a play about resistance, and it's a play about resistance of very, very brave people under the pressures of a much, much dominant system. And it will not take long until people will start making connections to modern-day Ukrainians who are now showing unbelievable courage in defending what they think is right in the face of oppression. So it is comforting to some extent to think that for all her loneliness, Antigone might have found some communality, at least with the other three figures who opposed the same ruler. But that just in parentheses. Now, last example, that of Euripides' Bacchae. Another case for role distribution. We need Dionysus for much of the play. He's almost always there, either in mortal disguise of a mortal or as the god himself. We have Tiresias, and then Cadmus, the second actor playing Cadmus, the two messengers and a servant. And then here the Tritagonistes is what interests me, namely the person playing Pentheus and Pentheus's mother, Agawi. Now, here's a brief passage from the so-called toilette scene where Pentheus in the play, under the spell of Dionysus, dresses up as a Maenad. He puts on a long linen robe, he does his hair very nicely with the locks plucked under, a mitre on his head, and so on, more and more under the spell of this god. And he has an enormous resistance against it. I'll turn into a woman. Will I look like a woman or not? But at the same time, a huge fascination. Now, particular fascination, and the man has great issues with his mother. So that's a general thing. One big question is, do I look like my mother? Now, just to say, what's quite staggering is Pentheus here dresses up to go and spy on the Maenads on Mount Kitairon. We then hear a messenger coming back to tell us of his sparagmos, Pentheus' own mother, and her followers ripped him apart. Now, after the messenger's speech, we see at some point Agawi, the mother, returning with Thyrsos and her son's head on top. Now, however that might have been the technicalities of that, whatever they are, it is quite striking that we see an actor dressing up, asking, do I look like my mother? And then coming back as that mother. So presumably all that needed to change is the mask, right? Again, lending this an unexpected layer of meaning. That works very well and chimes well with the meta-theatrical interest of the play and the question of genealogy that is at stake throughout. Mainly the god Dionysus' claim to vindicate his mother Semele, and the fact that he is the son of Dionysus. That's the main interest of the play, but it is of course mirrored in a very distorted way in the family relations of those who deny Dionysus' divinity, Pentheus and his mother. So with that, I will end. Are there any questions? Because if there aren't any questions, I'll quickly hijack the opportunity to make some noise for the Cambridge Greek play. So I am a co-producer of the Cambridge Greek play, a triennial event where we have professional directors and theatre people staging Greek plays in the ancient Greek, the original, with student performers. So we have 1, 2, 3, and sometimes scandalously even more actors and a bunch of chorus members, however many we can recruit, and they learn the texts, the choral odes by heart in ancient Greek, taught by our very finest scholars, by James Stigall and Anthony Bowen. They are taught over weeks to learn and pronounce the Greek properly, get the rhythms right. And so every 3 years we then have a performance, 4 days in October, where twice a day these plays are actually staged in the Cambridge Art Theatre. Now in 2022, this will be a double bill, so 2 plays together of Aeschylus' Persians and Euripides' Cyclops. And I think I put this, so for those who are interested now, this here is my email address, and I'm very happy to offer contact. We're of course very, very happy to work with schools, maybe to come and give talks about these plays, or just lure you in. Okay, thank you very much. And again, anyone who wants to ask a question or needs the handout, feel free to email. Okay, thank you. Sorry, did I speak much too long? Am I in time?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I better get started. We've only got half an hour. I'm Georgy Kantor. I'm ancient history tutor at St. John's College over in Oxford. I'm a Roman historian, and I suppose little did I know a couple of months ago when I volunteered to do this talk, and we were talking about a theme of performance and spectacle for this whole day, that this whole topic will sound horrendously topical for what's happening now, that we'll have a war on far away. There will be all sorts of questions of how propaganda in Russia misrepresents the war to the people. There will be all sorts of moral questions about how people observe the suffering and the fighting from afar through mass media. And I don't mean these parallels in a kind of facile way that Roman history somehow provides a key to modern aggression and imperialism and can somehow explain why Putin is so evil or anything like that, only in the sense that many of the similar themes arise in ancient and modern history, and comparative reflection broadens the mind and gives us different angles and different perspectives. And what I'm going to talk about today falls under three heads, three dimensions. One is foreign policy, as it were, as a spectacle for the Roman elite treating foreign policy as a kind of entertainment, elite pastime. The other, the second, is how did people in Rome and Italy, in the age of slower travel, in the age of slower communication before mass media, learn, or at least imagine they learned, what's going on abroad. And part of the answer, often, of course, what they've got was misrepresentation rather than any truthful account, is via spectacles. And the third dimension, is the use of spectacles as a tool of foreign policy. Spectacles used by Rome to influence and impress representatives of other nations. And I'll start with the first, and in many ways I'll return to this throughout, so I'll just give one striking example to begin with. This comes from Tacitus's Germania. A treatise written about all of these nations beyond the Rhine and the Danube at the very end of the 1st century AD. And here he talks about a conflict which destroyed the German tribe just beyond the Rhine, the tribe of the Bructeri. And what he rather terrifyingly enjoys about it, other than the fact that Romans didn't really have to apply much effort, is that Romans could observe it, the whole destruction of the tribes, the whole battle that brought the power of the Bructeri down and led to this horrifyingly mass slaughter. We don't, I suspect, need to put much trust in his precise figures. What we can say is that this was a terrifyingly bloody event. Happened, as he puts it, to gladden Roman eyes. Romans were spectators to that. What precisely he means, we don't really know. Were Roman ambassadors present? Could Roman troops observe it from their frontier forts? Probably a mix of both. But this whole element of foreign wars and indeed things that happen to foreign nations as a kind of spectator sport is very strongly present here. And of course, we have to remember, and that's something to which I shall return a bit further on, that Rome is at the very same time enjoying gladiatorial games and all of these shows of the amphitheater, which are in many ways imitation of battles and foreign wars. But equally, they treat real foreign wars as imitations of gladiatorial games. There is something quite sinister and in a way deeply unserious about this attitude to other human beings, and it is very pervasive in how Roman elite approaches foreign policy. But coming to, for the time being, to my second theme, what and how was known in Rome. And I've already said a moment ago that what was known in Rome and what actually happened somewhere far away was, of course, often a very different thing. Here is a pretty famous example of misrepresentation of that kind from a long inscription put by Augustus, or put by Augustus's successors, I better say, in front of Augustus's mausoleum to celebrate his achievement, which in a way is a spectacle of its own. There you go for a stroll on the Campus Martius, you come to this whole park around Augustus's monumental tomb. There is the grand inscription telling you what a great man Augustus was, and there were all these magnificent copies erected all over the empire, from which we actually know it's a Roman copy doesn't survive. It's the copies from Asia Minor, from modern Turkey, that survive. And here Augustus celebrates his achievements as a conqueror in Africa and Arabia in the 20s BC. Under my command and auspices, his religious authority, armies of the Roman people got deeper into Ethiopia, Sudan, as we would now say, it's not the modern territory of Ethiopia, and into Arabia, which is called Fortunate, which is basically modern Yemen, and you know, was there back then, and again this sounds horrifyingly topical right at the moment, and in a certain sense it's true. He did send those armies there in 26 and 25 BC. They did indeed get very deeply into those countries. It's also a complete misrepresentation. For one thing, Augustus wasn't there. Under his command is a story for the people of Rome. That's not what actually happened. He'd never been to either Ethiopia or Arabia, nor had any intention of going. For the other, the armies that got into Arabia, to the town of Mariba, and here we are, the great dam of Maribs, a great monument of irrigation architecture, foundations of which go back to 8th century BC, spent some time besieging the city unsuccessfully and then had to retreat after an absolutely catastrophic defeat. The whole story ended extremely badly, but the presentation of that to the city of Rome was very different. The expedition into Ethiopia was a bit more successful, but the year after that, Ethiopian army got into Egypt, and if you go to the British Museum, you can see this head of Augustus, which they carried away and buried under the entrance to a temple in Meroe, so that everyone entering the temple would step on Augustus's head. Hardly an enormous success of Roman arms, but again, not the story that Romans are getting. How did they tell this story in Rome? Part of it is obviously the inscription. Part of it was celebrations, spectacles, indeed the grand processions, the triumphal processions. You all no doubt heard about Roman triumph, the generals and eventually emperors arriving on their chariot to celebrate great victories abroad. Romans themselves were very, very aware that these triumphs are not always what they pretend to be. Here is Tacitus again talking about Domitian's triumph over Germany from his German war with a tribe called Catti in 83 AD. And according to Tacitus and Suetonius, at any rate, this was all a complete sham. He just bought slaves on the market and marched them through Rome, pretending they're prisoners of war, which incidentally shows dangers of misrepresentations, because archaeologically we can tell that Domitian's success in Germany was actually perfectly genuine. He did advance Roman border in Germany fairly considerably. It moved about 200 kilometers. There must have been some kind of military success. But because Roman elite and indeed common people of Rome got so cynical about this kind of representation of victories that didn't actually happen, with the victories that did happen, they semi-automatically assume that the emperor they don't like, that actually he made it all up. And this, of course, the triumphal processions had its own long cultural history. It influenced the way in which victories were represented by European monarchs, and indeed probably not only European, for many centuries afterwards. I give you two presentations of the triumph of Vespasian and Titus after the Jewish War of the late 60s, early 70s AD in Renaissance paintings done at the commission of Spanish kings who wanted to be seen as latter-day Roman emperors in the 16th and 17th century. And again, a combination of genuine celebration of success and a story which needn't be rooted into any kind of hard material reality, both in the way it's used or misused in 16th and 17th century, and in a way in which it was used or misused back in the 70s AD. Here is another big one from the 17th century, and you can see this crowd with a Winged Victory behind, who presumably wasn't really present, but there could be all sorts of figures carried around. They could carry all these silver processional statues behind the triumphant emperor. And here is, sorry about that, the Roman presentation of this same triumph. This is the Arch of Titus in the Forum, and this tells you in more ways than one how reality and this spectacular representation are difficult to disentangle. For one thing, although it's very often in guides to Rome for tourists referred to as Titus's triumphal arch, it actually isn't. It was built by his younger brother Domitian after Titus died, a decade after his triumph, because Domitian played no part in the whole military victory, and he wanted his share now in the 80s. Part of the story, I suppose, behind suspicions about his own later triumph. You can see here Titus riding his chariot, but because it's for Titus, Vespasian, who ought to be in the same chariot, isn't there. But also, of course, there is a very harsh material reality behind it all. The scale of victory in the Jewish war was massively exaggerated for the people of Rome. The new dynasty wanted its own foundational military victory, and it was elevated instead of the might of the whole enormous empire, suppressing a rebellion of one small province, into some kind of grandiose foreign war. But it was also a moment of pillage and loot on an absolutely enormous scale. The Jerusalem temple existed for centuries, burned down and looted, and here you can see the menorah from the Jerusalem temple being quite unashamedly carried in triumph and then being displayed for the people of Rome into the temple built to celebrate it all, which very congruously was the temple of peace, because that's, what Romans establish. Again, the line between reality and presentation. And this loot, apart from everything else, goes into funding spectacles in a quite literal sense. We talked at the beginning about foreign wars being seen as a kind of gladiatorial battles for Roman spectator. Well, here is the loot from foreign wars, quite literally funding gladiatorial spectacles. These are the two versions of the inscription on the new Flavian amphitheater, which we now know as the Colosseum. And what it says is Emperor Vespasian built ordered a new amphitheater to be built ex manubis, from the spoils, from his loot. And then when Titus succeeds, they insert a T, abbreviation for Titus, to show that Titus is involved. So the whole grand new building for the spectacles is a product of Roman foreign victory. And indeed what's displayed there is also a celebration of the empire's distant reach. Here is a coin of Domitian, minted about 3 years after the Colosseum opened for the public, showing the rhinoceros who was there for the kind of beast hunt. Gladiators would fight the rhinoceros in a kind of way in which you have bullfights in Spain these days, only, I suppose, even more dangerous. And this shows Rome's reach deep into Africa. And that is, for many of the people in Rome, the one way through this kind of rather bloody spectacles, in which they actually learn of the world beyond their everyday horizon. And here is a much earlier text, but the text is actually Vespasianic, but referring to a much earlier event. Canellus Balbus was a Roman governor in the province of Africa, around modern Tunisia, in Augustus's time, and he was the last Roman general who wasn't an emperor, who got a triumph. And here is Pliny the Elder in his Natural History saying that the source of Roman geography for all of these lands in Africa beyond the Sahara, he got all the way down to the Niger River, the furthest Roman army really ever got, is the list of towns they carried in the triumph of Balbus. Most of these places never come into Roman history before or after. Of course, they were unknown to your average Roman in the streets. And it's only through these elite celebrations of their military success that people in the streets of Rome hear about them. They experience them through, rhinoceros brought to Rome and lists of unknown places carried in front of them. And that raises all sorts of both cognitive and moral questions about their relationship to imperial foreign policy. Here, to give you an idea where he got the blue line in the middle down to the city called Gao is the expedition of Balbus. And here I come also to the final dimension. I mentioned it at the beginning. Foreign spectacles as a tool of foreign policy, spectacles as addressed not just to the people of Rome, but also to representatives of foreign peoples, kingdoms, nations. And the scene of our next story is this building, the biggest theatre in Rome, the theatre of Pompey, which in itself, like the Colosseum, was a monument to the victories of Vespasian and Titus, was a monument to Pompey's eastern victories in the 60s BC, and again built from his war spoils. And here we have ambassadors from Frisia, German tribe, basically the territory of modern Netherlands. And they are brought into the theatre to show Rome off. They are awaiting their audience with Nero, who, as Tacitus sarcastically remarks, is intent on other concerns, getting drunk, singing, chariot riding, and they are having their cultural program in the course of the sights normally shown to the barbarians. They entered Pompey's theatre to observe the size of the population. Part of it is, of course, to show them what a grand thing Rome is. Here is the biggest city in the world. 1 million people live in it, the largest city anywhere west of China till the 19th century. And there they see Roman people organized in all of their various institutional groups. It's a spectacle in itself, the people present in the theatre. And they play part in it. They see the places for privileged ambassadors. They march in, they say, oh, well, we are not any worse than those people given seats with the senators. And that sort of helps their embassy. So it plays both ways. They're trying to impress on Roman people that here are all of these ambassadors from foreign nations attending on the emperor. The emperor must be grand if they all come. They're trying to impress on ambassadors that Rome is this grandiose and very well organized concern, but also they're trying to get these ambassadors to play for Roman status. We really want these seats next to the senators. That's, in a way, accepting the rules of the game as Romans want them. And my final example is where this doesn't quite go to the plan. So that's again in Nero's time. Rome had a big war with Parthians over who will control Armenia, and in the end they agree that the Parthian candidate for Armenian kingship will get the kingdom, but he'll go to Rome to get his crown from the hands of the emperor. And his visit is turned into grandiose spectacle, meant to impress both the Roman people, who need to be told that Nero won the war when he didn't, and to impress Tiridates. Rome is gigantic, Rome is splendid. Roman spectacles are the best spectacles. Curtains stretched overhead to keep off the sun, they were of purple, embroidered figure of Nero driving the chariot, golden stars glimmering all about him. And Nero has his own cultural program to impress Tiridates. He plays the lyre, he rides the chariot, and Tiridates really doesn't like it. He is not impressed at all. He is, according to the Romans at least, somewhat impressed by the scale of things. But Nero, as the emperor, and the kind of program Nero lays out for him, don't impress him at all. He thinks it's all going to go terribly wrong. And he's right in that. A few years later, Rome descends into civil war, Nero falls on his sword, and this whole impressive show falls apart very catastrophically indeed. We only, of course, see Tiridates' reaction through Roman eyes. There is this whole system of mirrors reflecting onto mirrors. Can we get, as historians, really to Tiridates' mind? But it's interesting that Romans themselves, at any rate, could reflect on the failure of their spectacle. I think we are up for time, but we have time for a few questions if anyone wants to ask one. Okay.
I'm sorry, I had one question quickly. Sorry. It might be quite a stupid one, but who was financing all these spectacles? Where was the money coming from?
In large part, simply from taxation. So people in Rome and Italy, in the early imperial period and late republican period, didn't really pay taxes, which made them happier with the empire than they would otherwise be. But provinces, the overseas provinces, were sometimes quite heavily taxed, and the money emperors got that way, large parts of it was spent on entertaining people at the center of the empire. And sometimes, like with Vespasian's victory, or I don't know, Trajan's victory in Dacia, they come back with huge spoils of a foreign war, and that's the point when they lay down really grandiose spectacles. When Trajan conquers Dacia, he has 123 days of non-stop entertainment for the people of Rome, and that's how the people of Rome know that his victory been really grand, because he can pay for spectacles on that scale.
Hi, I also have a question. So that was all in imperial Rome. How much, like in other periods, so the kingdom and the empire, like was there much of this going on as well?
Sorry, what period?
Like the kingdom.
Well, about early Rome, we don't really know much that is genuinely historical. We know the late Republican, early imperial tradition about it, but much of it is very clearly fiction. They imagined that early Roman kings already had triumphs, and that this whole tradition of spectacular celebration of foreign victories really goes back the whole way to Romulus. But they couldn't possibly have known anything reliable about it.
I have a question. So in terms of entertainment for the general population, how much did sort of the general population really care about these triumphs and sort of foreign victories and sort of the showing of that, sort of in comparison to something a little more tangible like gladiatorial games and so things that they could sort of really experience?
I don't think there was a very clear boundary between the two. Gladiatorial games, in many ways, were also a celebration of foreign victories. You know, you come to the Colosseum, you see it's built from the money for foreign victories. You are getting all of these exotic animals brought from very distant parts of the world because the emperor is so successful. You get gladiators in all sorts of national costumes of distant countries. So that, in a way, is in itself a celebration of foreign policy. Quite what the reactions of the common people were is, of course, very difficult to tell often, because most of our sources come from the elite. And we also have to appreciate that a lot of people who attended the games weren't exactly poor either. The structure of sitting at Roman spectacles was very hierarchical, with, you know, wealthy and privileged people getting all the best seats. So it's not necessarily meant for the genuinely poor and getting those on board. It's meant for kind of elite, sub-elite groups. I think we have time for one more question, and I'll probably need to give up the podium for the next talk after that.
Do we know what Rome's biggest triumph would have been?
In terms of the biggest celebration?
Yes.
Trajan's Dacian triumph, as far as we can tell.
Thank you.